Good evening, everybody. Justin, so good to be with you.
The man,
As
good to
usually,
see you.
Wellness Wednesdays. It's going to be a good one tonight. Welcoming everybody this evening. In fact, it might even be an eye opener. It may challenge a lot of what you thought you knew about heart health, cardiovascular health, specifically around cholesterol, but we're taking it beyond that, asking the question whether or not numbers of cholesterol really are the ultimate measure of risk. And is heart disease genetic fate, or can it be prevented regardless of family history? So tonight's all about how we unravel the most persistent myths about cardiovascular wellness and uncovering cutting edge science that puts you in control of your own destiny, specifically when it comes to heart health. But of course, heart's connected to everything. And we've got the best guest for this. Leading this transformative session this evening. Of course, Justin and I will weigh in as necessary, but is none other than Dr. Johnny Bowden. And sir, I love the shades.
My wife just got these for me, and they have a slight shade, and I realize they look like sunglasses, so
They're slick, man. You're always up with fashion as well. When you feel good and look good, you are good. But let me just remind folks, you're highly credited PhD, CNS. You're in fact a world-renowned expert in nutrition and heart health, but no, it's the nutrition mythbuster. You know, you've authored 15 best-selling books, of which I'm the first to attest to. Were early days in my own education, some leading and very transformative for myself, but leading literature. You're always the Vortrekker, the trailblazer in this stuff, including, by the way, the more recent Great Cholesterol Myth with Dr. Sinclair. You tell us a little bit more about that and some upcoming work you might have going on. But I also am a huge fan of the 150 healthiest foods on Earth. We can maybe even talk a little bit about centenarians, you know, people that live beyond 100 and why. Your no nonsense approach. Yes. This no nonsense approach, and we're asking everyone to weigh in. We'll talk about the poll in a second. Asking questions is typical to the webinar format that we host, but we love your no nonsense approach. We all know that you've captivated audiences worldwide from TV appearances. You've done numerous Dr. Oz shows, CNN, countless speeches, conferences like Paleo FX, Beijing University. And honestly, Doc, you know, your ability to blend this groundbreaking leading science into practical advice, always with that touch of humor and style. You know, we appreciate you being here to empower us with these tools to make better, more informed, life-changing decisions for your cardiovascular health. So we want everyone to be, as per usual, part of the conversation. We have a poll this evening. I'll get through that in a second. And at the top of the hour, as per usual, we'll get all of your questions, your burning questions around cardiovascular myths answered if they haven't already been during the course of the webinar. But welcome, sir. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you as well. Justin is one of our consummate, as you know. You've been interviewed by him in the past on one of our podcasts. Consummate clinician, biohacker extraordinaire. I know he's got questions for you. I've got questions for you. But let's just start with this sort of general overview. Like, what was your impetus, real quick, about becoming that myth buster? How did you end up as doc, PhD, but your desire to get out there and just because cardiovascular disease is just known hard science, isn't it?
Many questions there to unpack. I think that the reason that I kind of entered it as a contrarian, if you will, or somebody who became known as the nutrition mythbuster, is that I came into the field as an outsider. And there's a lot to be said for that. Because sometimes when people have been doing something a certain way for generations and generations, they're not always as able to see the forest because they're living in the trees, you know, and sometimes an outsider's perspective can be very, very helpful. I will give you an example that's a better example than I am. One of the loudest and most authoritative and most interesting and scholarly voices in the movement to kind of rethink cholesterol is not a doctor at all. He's a master engineer. He's the guy that they send in when Sony gets hacked. He comes in with a team. This is the level of engineering that they do. And they go through can you imagine going through some and figure out how the hack happened? And he's a systems analyst. And his name is Ivor Cummings. You probably know who he is, the Fat Emperor. He's got a podcast. And he got into this because his doctor gave him a cholesterol test and said, well, you got heart diseases and your cholesterol is elevated here, and this means this. And he said, I want to understand that a little more. Would you explain the pathways? And he looked at it the same way that you would look at a engineering product, or if you were a commercial engineer, a product engineer, you'd look at, the safety studies or whatever it is. And he just analyzed it as data. And he said, if this data were given to me, if I were asked to decide if a product could be taken to market based on safety data that was like this cholesterol data, I would not let them take it to market. And he has become, since quite a voice in this field. And I mention him because that's kind of, I'm not comparing myself to him, but I'm saying sometimes an outsider's perspective can let you see things that you are blinded to when you're in the system. So I had a fairly unusual background for a nutritionist. Music degree in college, master's degree in psychology, all but actually ABD, all but dissertation. I was going on for my PhD in psychology, switched over to nutrition, degree in nutrition, board certified. So I actually came in a little bit differently. And I started, and if you're asking how I got to be a myth buster on the cholesterol thing, I certainly didn't start out being interested in that. I was a weight loss coach. My first job in the industry was 1991 at Equinox. And I was a personal trainer with 6 certifications in personal training. And I became the head of not the head of the dean of the Equinox Fitness Training Institute. And we taught trainers, and we went to, and that's all I knew. And the only thing I knew about nutrition was what we were taught by the American Dietetic Association. Thank God they don't exist anymore. They've changed their name, but it was a contentious, ridiculous cold of water for the doctors organization that basically didn't think you need supplements. It was, and of course, the prevailing wisdom at the time was low fat diets and calorie counting. And mea culpa, I was right there. I was right with them. I was one of those guys who would order an egg white omelet, probably the stupidest nutritional idea in history. I'd order the egg white omelet. It would come with a little bit of runny yolk, and I'd send it back because I knew in my DNA, cholesterol, heart attack, that I can't eat that egg yolk. So I was a true believer in this. And our clients would come to us and they would say, we're not really losing weight on this low-fat diet. And we would think they're lying. We would think the prevailing culture was such that if these people were exercising and eating the way we were telling them, and they weren't losing weight, it had to be their fault. We would never sit back and actually say, I wonder if the stuff we're telling them is maybe we should look at that. And we just assumed that they were cheating on their diets, or they weren't burning as many calories as they thought they were. And in this atmosphere, very polarized atmosphere about, low fat, and we would have clients come in and they would say, I'm not losing weight. And Atkins had just published the 3rd edition of the New Diet Revolution. His revolutionary book that came out in 1972, 3 editions, 1992 is the latest edition, and it was in the news. So we would have these people coming in and they'd say, doc, not doc, but we're not really getting it on the low fat diet. I think, my golfing buddy told me about this Atkins thing. I want to try that. And we would scream, you can't do that. You might lose a pound here and there. Maybe you'll lose some weight, but you're going to die of a heart attack. This guy's a quack. You can't follow that. But they did it anyway. And guess what? They didn't die. And in many, many cases, they came back. And their eyes were, and Bryce, you know this, Justin, you know this, you look at people and you get a real sense of health and vitality in their eyes and their posture, and they looked better and their eyes were clearer. And then you look at their blood test, which I didn't even know how to interpret at the time. In 1992, I'm a personal trainer. I don't know about a blood test, but their doctors were telling them, gee, Mr. Jones, your triglycerides dropping, your blood pressure is lower, and all these things. What are you doing? And they'd say, well, doc, I tried the Atkins diet. And they'd say, you can't do that. That'll kill you. So that was the level of religious fervor that people had for the low-fat diet. They wouldn't even believe the evidence in front of their eyes. They'd say to these clients, you know, you're doing great. What are you doing? They'd say Atkins, and you'd say, no, you can't do that. So I had been trained in psychology. There is a very important concept in psychology that everybody should know about called cognitive dissonance. It means you cannot hold two beliefs that are contradictory at the same time. Either this thing is black or it's white. You can't say, oh, it's black and it's white. They don't work together. They don't work with reality. And I had cognitive dissonance. Either what we were told, which is Atkins diet will kill you, don't eat any saturated fat, it'll raise your cholesterol, which will cause heart disease, and you will die. Either that's true, or, and this guy standing in front of me is an illusion, or this guy is having results that kind of question what we were taught. One of these two things can't be right. And that's what caused me to start to question conventional wisdom. And that was just a long bed in the beginning of a long slide of, wait a minute, coffee's always bad? I'm not so sure that's true. Wait, soy's a health food? Wait, where'd you get that from? And what's the evidence now? Oh, it seems to reduce cholesterol, but what if cholesterol is not the problem we think it is, or we're understanding it differently? What happens to that? And what I asked myself was, if what we have been taught is not exactly correct, I mean, for example, why did every major three-letter dietary or government organization tell you not to eat saturated fat or animal products? There's only one reason, because it raises cholesterol.
All right.
And why do we care about that? Because cholesterol causes heart disease. So if your cholesterol goes up, you're going to die. If that's not 100% true, what happens to the dietary recommendations? They're like a set of dominoes. They're built on that, and if you knock out that, the dietary recommendations fall like a house of cards. And that's what kind of started me on looking at how we are marketed certain ideas, how we come to believe certain ideas. And my psychology background was right there active, going, of course, this is how social psychology works, social proof. This is how ideas get contagion and start to get passed around and not re-examined. And that's why people still think Al Gore said he invented the internet, which he never said, but everybody said it, and they said it enough that people think it. And that's kind of what happened with low-fat diets. There was some evidence. I never like to say nobody did well on low-fat diets. I always
and herein comes the conversation around genomics. By and large, there's variations in the population that explain either end of the bell curve. And there's nothing often better than genomics. So and thanks for that history. It's always so intriguing to me. And thank goodness a lot of names have followed in suit since. I mean, when people talk about, for lack of a better term, and I give you this in all due respect, trust me when I say the granddaddy of functional medicine and nutrition and myth busting, it's you. But thank goodness we've got other great people like Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, even Dr. Terry Walls, Perma.
Well, I think you have the order a little wrong. Those are the great ones. I came afterwards, and I
Frank Littman,
like that. So,
anyway, the point is you got out there in advocacy, right? There's a lot of people. Not everyone is comfortable enough to jump on a pedestal and really get it straight. You know what's interesting? When you first mentioned engineer, and this is kind of ironic, one of the first things that came to mind was Dr. Kolff and his invention of artificial organs. Like, he was the master of the artificial heart, which, by the way, showcases the absolute brilliance of modern medicine. So we're not here to bash it. It has its place, but it underscores a healthcare system which is deeply rooted in rescue and triage rather than prevention, right? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to heart health, we see a similar pattern with the cholesterol myth, focusing on, lowering these numbers with medications rather than addressing root causes like inflammation, right? Which you taught me is, the whole underpinning. It's the reason that there is a warrant for deposition of cholesterol in the first place. We're going to get into that and unpack it, or for that matter, promoting preventive strategies like exercise. And we want to start with this. I know it's overarching and sort of, again, another big question, but how do we move the focus from reactive fixes to empowering folks with preventive tools like genomics and keep them out of the operating room in the first place. And before you answer that, by the way, I just want to encourage folks to, again, go over and chime in on the polls, because we're asking some questions to better understand you. Who's our audience joining us this evening? We want to angle our questions to you, and these are well, we have some results actually. Okay, so people have answered. A lot of people have answered. We've got, do you have a family history of cardiovascular disease? Not surprising, but also, somewhat shockingly, 58% of folks say yes in a parent or sibling. That's not uncommon. An extended family, 12%. No known history is by and large the minority, and only about 4% don't know, because it is part of a typical, intake and history if you do have a family doctor, which, by the way, is harder and harder to get these days. Which age range do you fall into? And the majority of folks tuning in this evening are actually 72% are 61 plus, which is very interesting. We have thousands of followers and who join us into various, topics of conversation in these webinars. But folks that are having, I suppose the highest impetus to learn are those that may in fact already have pre-existing conditions or diagnoses. By the way, we're also speaking to a large body of clinicians this evening, people that have their own certifications, including ours, functional genomic practitioners. 25% are between 46 and 60. But here's the thing. Unfortunately, that's a real J curve. We should, be flipping this, should start young, because, this is how we get to preventing. So this is information you could take to your children, your nieces, your nephews. Please share the love. Third question was, have you experienced any of these symptoms that could indicate cardiovascular issues? 13% say pain, chest pain or discomfort. 12% say shortness of breath. Irregular heartbeat or palpitations. 31% say fatigue or lightheadedness. 27%. No symptoms are 54% of the population. So, of course, we can't diagnose anything, but just to get a general idea as to, what people may be subjectively experiencing out there. Last but not least, number 4, we've got a question that's asking about a lifestyle factor, if there is one, because it's a single choice. Do you think has the biggest impact on heart health? And it's actually a real divide. Diet and physical activity are 31 and 22% respectively. Stress management is equal to physical at 22%, and only about 12% acknowledging that sleep quality. Of course, it's the argument is all of this is important. So we didn't trick anybody. We asked them. We asked them to be specific. If they had to choose one, which one would it be? And so we forced them to choose one. But the reality.
What would you choose, Bruce?
I'll tell you something.
If you had to.
Well, I'll tell. Yeah. So always in context, right? And thanks for flipping it back to me here. But
Justin is next, by the way.
Okay, sounds good. I'll tell you what. I personally believe that stress, whether it's, and I'm going to qualify, not just mental, emotional, but physical, chemical. All right. The stress that ultimately contributes to the inflammatory processes that impact the lumen of the artery lining that warrant the deposition of cholesterol and plaques, and even those that end up breaking them through, hypertension unrelated to primary but secondary hypertension. I think stress is probably number one North American-wide silent killer, which contributes to diabetes, obesity, cancer, and heart disease. That's my personal opinion.
What do you say, Justin?
I'm going to say stress, but I'm going to say it for a little bit of a different reason, because I think that the wrong diet is a form of stress.
Yeah.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah, that's
or exercising improperly, either under or over exercising. Both of those are stressful to the body. Not getting enough sleep is a form of stress.
Absolutely.
Right? So it is stress, but it's just that's kind of what encompasses every other category on the questionnaire.
And one of the people in the chat just said, what about toxin load? I would put that in the same category. That is a stressor to the body.
It's stressful.
Right.
And when we get to the end and we talk about the longevity thing, and you had asked me about something about 100-year-olds, and I think did you mention that, or did I?
We're going to get into some of the logic and reasoning.
I will show you exactly how that fits into this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, my vote would be stress as well, gentlemen.
we're all on the same page, physical, mental, emotional, all of these are stressors. And I feel lack of sleep, as Justin was describing, all contribute. So here's myth number one. Heart disease only affects older people. That's been around for way too long. And frankly, by the way, there's some shocking, and I'll just sort of say as an aside, a recent study, you're well familiar with this, a 2023 study showed a 13% increase in heart attacks among individuals 25 to 44 who aren't here listening.
How interesting is that?
I mean, linked to poor diet, sedentary behavior, and stress. Of course, we've been talking about this, but early arterial plaque buildup. And now people are getting more and more tested. We'll unpack testing as well, besides genetics, right? Functional real-time testing. But as early as in their 20s, and this is using advanced imaging beyond, calcium ionization and ultrasounding and so forth. But here's the thing. I mean, I think there's an underpinning to why this is happening. Some of it's controversial, but answer us if you don't mind that or clarify this myth, and how do we dispel it around how this only affects older people?
Yeah, I wasn't even sure that's still a myth, because, we can see all these things that we weren't able to see before, and these early signs and things like that. And I don't, it's kind of like addressing the myth that the world is flat. I mean, I didn't even think people still thought that this still only affects older people, but the fact is it does affect. If you were looking at the stats, and I don't have them in front of me, certainly more people over 60 die of heart attacks than people, 20 and under. But it happens, but it happens less frequently in your 20s and your 30s. Which may be one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get 20-year-olds to pay attention to this.
Right.
They're not seeing their buddies dropping dead.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I don't think it's unique to this. And I think we should put it in the context of, like, we're talking about behavior change in a society. It's impossible to talk about that in the area of health without looking at how behavior is shaped and changed in society in general. We are a quick fix solution. We have a tiny attention span. It used to be 4 to 11 seconds. I think with the advent of TikTok and all of that, it's probably down to about 8 seconds before you flip the page or swipe right or whatever it is you do to check to the next video. It's meant to be addictive. It's meant to hijack your dopamine pathways and get you looking for the next hit and the next like and the next video and the next thing. So in that kind of a context, getting people to think about long-term goals is a very difficult challenge, not limited to health. Try to get a 20-year-old, there are some who will, but try to get a 20-year-old to think about long-term savings, about putting money in compounding accounts. They're like, what are you kidding? I need money for Friday night. Right. I need money for the new iPad. What are you talking about? Mutual funds. So it's hard to get people who are in this kind of a culture where things change every moment, and it's the next bright shiny thing, and I want instant gratification on every single metric that I am interested in. It's hard to get them to say, dude, the way you eat now is going to affect how you feel in 20 years. Believe me. I use my age as, like, that's my credential when I talk to young people. I say, I'm 78, man. You want to, and here's what I do. I get up every day without an alarm clock. I play tennis 2 hours a day, 5-6 days a week. I have an incredible, passionate relationship with my young wife. Well, she's not young, but she's, 50 something, and she's 20 years younger than me. And I am joyous about every day. Do you want to feel like this, or do you want to feel like that other guy who's my age, who's 10 years older than me and is looks like he's about to keel over? Because you got to do it starting when you, at that age that you're doing it now. I didn't start anything healthy till I was 38. So I know that it's not too late to start, in your late 30s.
Yeah,
right.
I think today's actions determine tomorrow's reality, right? Like, it's almost like when we talk about heart disease not showing up until older age, that's
not showing up. Exactly.
Up. It's not
that's
that
right.
It started right then, right? Like, if I plant poison ivy right now, it's totally benign right now.
Right
but
now.
It's going to start to grow and get bigger, and a decade from now, I've got a big poison ivy plant. Well, absolutely. Now it can hurt me, right? So
yeah, and even
effect.
And another example, Justin, is smoking. If you did a study on the damage that smoking does, and you ended it after 30 days, the tobacco industry would be able to say, we have a great study here, and there was absolutely no difference between smokers and non-smokers in this 4-month period. None.
Not to mention potentially even an uptick in benefit from nicotine and before the toxins take place. But you're making a good point. Here's what's notable in my opinion, and some of this is published and available in the American Heart Association. The NIH has obviously published a lot around heart disease, and it's one of the number one, scientific, tracking focuses when it comes to general health. But between 2010 and 2022. Cardiovascular disease death rates increased about 20%, more than that. I think it was even 21% between the ages of 25 and 64. And rates declined about 10% in adults 65 or older. So that's exactly the opposite. And these trends, I think they're in line, again, maybe second myth to bust, true or false, but or support with increasing prevalence of specific youth factors. So we're talking about obesity, right? This has raised over 40%, and diabetes, has raised significantly. And pre-diabetes, right? Metabolic syndrome, generally speaking, all of that underscores the critical need really for heightened awareness and proactive measures in the youth early in life. But again, how do we reframe the position of creating interest preemptively, right? That's the question.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. That's more for social psychologists figuring out how to reach certain markets. But I do know that we have a very active audience that are active people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And we should talk to them about starting right now because they're here in the room with us and listening. And 60, I'm old enough to be a 60-year-old father. All right. So I'm telling you, kids, start listening to and doing this stuff now because it will make a big difference.
Right. Well, here, let's get into the thick of it. This is the big one, and there's a bunch of stuff that will, extrapolate from this, generally speaking. And you wrote the book on it. That cholesterol alone determines heart disease risk. I mean, it's a big one, but it's still prevalent. Maybe not the, people that are older get heart attacks. This is the big one. It's still prevalent. Why?
Because it's an easy solution. There was a quote that I used in one book. I think it was Upton Sinclair. It might have been. It was a writer who said, H.L. Mencken, sorry, who said, for every complex problem, there is a simple solution, and it is almost always wrong. But yet it's easy, and you now have a $31 billion, I think at last count, dollar industry a year on lowering cholesterol. Nobody's eager to change that.
Right.
And let me be clear about something, because I think this is a really important point. Stephen Sinatra, the cardiologist, and I, who wrote the book, we wrote it at a very polarized time where nobody was looking at anything but total cholesterol, which I definitely want to. You want to talk about myths? Let's talk about that one in a minute. But that's all people were looking at. Maybe HDL and LDL. People were getting statin prescriptions based on their total cholesterol. It's still happening today. So we were very passionate about getting our point of view that we are measuring cholesterol incorrectly and we are looking at the wrong metrics. And we came off as being very anti-statin and like cholesterol doesn't matter. And that always happens when you have thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis. You have a position that's out there and then people are trying to correct it so badly that the same thing with calories. When we were saying, guys, it's not all about the calories. Hormones drive weight gain. It's not just the calories. And because of that information about calories causing it being at the cause of everything was so predominant and people believed it so passionately, the faction that said, no, it's not all about calories got very strident until it sounded like we were saying calories didn't matter at all. Calories do matter. They're just not the most important thing or the only thing. And I would say about our book and about what we're talking about, gentlemen, cholesterol does matter. It's just A, we're measuring it wrong. B, we're not looking at other stuff. And C, it's very far from the whole story. So it's not that it doesn't matter. It's not that there's never a place for a statin in a prescription, but our emphasis has been wrong. And our measuring of cholesterol has been wrong. You talk about myths. I'm going to quote somebody else's book. I always promote other people's books because many times they say things better than I could. So the best book ever written, gentlemen, on anti-aging, I go on record as saying this as of 2025, the best book I have ever read on anti-aging.
Peter Attia's?
Huh? Peter Attia's book, Outlive. Correct. This is a quote from Peter Attia. I love giving this quote on podcasts everywhere. I don't even have to take credit for it. I just want people to know it. Peter Attia said that total cholesterol has as much to do with your risk of dying from a heart attack as your hair color.
Yeah.
Let that sink in, ladies and gentlemen. A doctor giving you a statin based on your total cholesterol is following an algorithm and trying to avoid a lawsuit. He's not looking out for your good. So then we get into LDL and HDL. That's a little better than total. Although I can't tell you the number of people who come to me and say, my cholesterol is too high and they want to put me in. I said, what is it? And it's 230. I said, did they look at HDL, LDL? Did they look at, but HDL, LDL is antiquated. It's out of style. It's out of date. It's 1963 medicine. We now know through the magic of microscopes and the ability to measure things that LDL comes in many different subclassifications. HDL, there's 2A and 2B. There's functional HDL. There's oxidized LDL. There's LP little a. There's LDL 3 and 3A. There's just a lot of subdivisions, and it comes in different sizes. Some of it is big, fluffy particles, LDL. Some of them are little, tiny, inflamed golf balls. We need to know those things. And HDL, LDL is like getting a medical diagnosis that says short or tall. Well, short and tall are variables that probably you would know better than I, but there's probably some conditions that are more associated with being 4'11" and some that are more associated with being 6'11" and things like that. You would want to know if they're short or tall, but you want to do a medical diagnosis based on good and bad cholesterol? That's crazy. So that's myth number one, that total cholesterol is good for anything, except, filling out prescriptions that shouldn't be written.
Right.
The second, I think, important myth about it is that we're looking that there's such a thing as good and bad cholesterol. So let me explain that. If you take cholesterol and you put it under the microscope, it is the same cholesterol, whether it's in the HDL or the LDL. The LDL and HDL, those things stand for the last L in HDL and the last L in LDL. The common factor is lipoprotein. That is the carrier. There's high density lipoprotein, which just means it's high density. It sinks if you put it in water. And there's low density lipoprotein, which just means it floats. But it's the lipoprotein that's the container, and cholesterol is a passenger. So if you were trying to manage a street corner as a cop and you were trying to prevent accidents, what do you want to know? The most important piece of data you want to know is how many cars are on this road. Why do you want to know that? Because there are more likely to be accidents when there's a lot of cars and a lot of traffic and a lot of speeding. If you're a bouncer in a bar, what do you want to know? How many people are going to be here tonight? 10 people or 10,000? I don't care if you have the nicest people in the world. You have 10,000 people in a small arena. Guess what's going to happen? Somebody's going to spill a drink. Someone's going to get drunk. Somebody's going to get mad, look at somebody in the wrong way, and you're going to have a fight. Much more likely than if you only have 10 people. So what do we want to know now? Not what the cargo of the boat is, not what they're carrying in the glove compartment of the car. We want to know how many cars there are, how many boats are in the water, how many people are in the bar. And that's what the modern tests do. They don't look at LDL. They do look at LDL-H, HDL, and LDL, but they also look at LDL-P, which stands for particles, particles being the lipoprotein. How many damn lipoproteins are there in circulation? That's what we want to know. That's what a prescription should be written about. If your particle number is 2,500, I have no problem with a prescription for a statin. If your total cholesterol is 230, I have a big problem with a prescription for a statin. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Well, I know you do, but the audience.
No, again, and I also get that was rhetorical. But
And
you know,
size, let's talk about the size for 1 second. The arterial wall, let's think of it like chicken wire. It should have a tight juncture. It should be closed to foreigners, to objects that are coming into the digestive system and don't belong in the bloodstream. That's what the gut wall is supposed to protect you from. That's what the arterial wall is supposed to protect you from, right? Not supposed to have holes for things to get into and do damage. If you throw a big volleyball at a tennis net, think the tennis net is your arterial wall. The volleyball's not going to do any damage. It's not going to do any good, but it's not going to do any damage. Big fat volleyball. You take a little inflamed golf ball, put it on fire, and toss it with all your might at that tennis net. What's going to happen to the tennis net? There's going to be a hole, and that hole in the artery wall, if we go back to the analogy, that hole is going to be patched over with cholesterol and calcium and other material, and plaque is going to form. But the size of the LDL matters, because the big ones just are kind of neutral. So we want to know, do you have small particles or big particles? And there is a measure on those tests. It says, are you pattern A, pattern B? Pattern A is mostly big fluffy volleyballs. Pattern B, for bad, easy to remember, that's the bad little inflamed ones. So why would you not use this information when you're making a prescription for heart disease? Why would you still use good and bad cholesterol? It's like a sixth grader. I mean, it should just defy the smell test. How can anything in the body, any metabolic process, any gene be a good one or a bad one when there are so many factors that it works with like that?
Yeah, I take issue with calling anything that the body makes on its own bad. Right. Like even we talk about oxidants, like reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species.
Sometimes they're useful.
Yeah, they have a job. LDL has a job, just same as a toxic estrogen metabolite. It's like saying God made a mistake, right? If LDL is bad, then why would we produce it at all? It's got a role.
Well, let me ask you a question though about that. That's a great point, but like you and I and Bryce, we always say the bad Alzheimer's gene. I mean, that's a gene nobody wants. It's not really a good thing to have, but maybe the analogy breaks down because some genes are not desirable, or they're desirable, or even, come to think of it, wait, let me just correct myself. Sickle cell anemia, that occurs as a protective mechanism against a particular mosquito that exists where sickle cell anemia was, where they used to have large numbers of that. It was literally the body's way of protecting it against an even bigger danger.
Right.
And I don't know whether that was malaria or some other disease carried by mosquitoes, which kill more people than any other.
Malaria.
Yeah, it was malaria. So even that gene, whatever the gene for sickle cell anemia was, had a function at one point. It had a good function. It just, not something that you want to have. So I think there are some things that are maybe bad and good, but usually they have different functions. And the notion anyway that cholesterol comes in two flavors of good and bad is completely a myth, whether the analogies hold up or not. That just isn't so.
Well, and then I have our next myth for you, but I got to weigh in on this because
please do.
The whole idea behind a mixed bag of genes, for that matter, cholesterol genes, is more ideal, and there's no right or wrong. We talk about that at the DNA company all the time. Individuals with perfect cardiovascular genetics, as we see it, those that emulate sort of a lower inflammatory risk, a lower risk for cholesterol carrying capability, a lower risk for how they translates. And this leads me to my next myth, by the way. Fats from their diet, they might assume that they're invincible and neglect other critical factors, right? Like exercise management and insulin. That weighs in a huge deal, right? And even toxins. So point I'm making is genetic diversity offers protective trade-offs. And a mixed bag of cholesterol-related genes often means that there may be some risk for one area, cholesterol carrying, but the body compensates in other areas. So I'll give you an example. Certain, ApoE4. We just talked, like that's what you brought up, right? ApoE4.
That's the Alzheimer's, the so-called
Alzheimer's. Encourages. We have to have awareness around diet and lifestyle changes. Which reduces those.
Yep.
But it used to mean something in the evolutionary chain of events where that cohort were much better able to defend immunologically against acute infection. So it remained, and it does continue to remain part of the diversity within that's just how genes work. But here's the question, uh, because genes are genes and they influence heavily. But the myth is that dietary cholesterol significantly raises blood cholesterol. Why does that persist? And by the way, it's slowly but surely, because of our consumption of social media, we're becoming more and more aware of the fact, that it got tainted. You can talk about the Ansel, Keys thing if you want quickly for these people here. Some of them probably know about it, but with the carnivore diet and the keto diet and all these other diets have sort of helped us to reconsider that. But what's it about? Why did it start? Why does it persist?
Oh, I can answer it very simply and people will understand it immediately. Okay, you're in the government and you have to make some recommendations and you believe that cholesterol in the blood is a very bad thing and you want people to be aware of it. Nobody's ever heard of it. It's 1950s. Eisenhower just had the heart attack. You're looking for an answer. They were looking for things and they settle on cholesterol. Even Ansel Keys knew that the cholesterol you ate didn't matter, but they literally said, you know what? They're not going to understand that. We're telling them about a new concept, this cholesterol thing. People didn't even know what it was. We cannot give them ifs, ands, and buts. Well, you can eat it, but you can't have it in your blood. No, it's bad. Just stay away from it. And that's how that started. And these people are just not, it's just like it's not trying to turn around the Queen Elizabeth. It's not a tugboat. It doesn't turn around quickly. You don't change, entrenched beliefs like that. Look at the Al Gore invented the internet thing. You think if they can't change that, how are they going to change the notion that eating cholesterol doesn't mean anything? And again, so let me put a little asterisk there. There is a condition, and you would know this, of course, familial hypercholesterolemia. It's a genetic condition. What does it affect? Less than 5%. I think it's less than 1% of the population. Those people are an exception. But if you don't have that genetic condition, these people have 400 cholesterol if they look at an egg. I mean, it's a completely different set of circumstances. And Peter Attia once interviewed the world's expert on familial hypercholesterolemia. It was a 3-hour interview. Most of it was even over my head. It's clearly a specialty. And Steve and I used to say, whatever we're saying, that does not apply to familial hypercholesterolemia. It's a different condition. But for all the other 99.99% of you can eat all the eggs you want. It does not make a difference.
Well, and including the studies that started around, 2010 that flipped the switch on this, including your book. The British Medical Journal, American Heart Association, that
Annals of Internal Medicine. There's so many studies I stopped being able to remember all of them and quote them at random, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens.
Yeah. Well, and again, underscoring the idea that fat intake is not directly correlated with heart disease in the absence of systemic inflammation, oxidative stress, and some of these other risks that we're talking about. And here's what I want to drive home, if you could support this notion or demystify it, but that saturated fat has been shown to raise HDL cholesterol. In fact, without it, you can't. Right? HDL. I mean, again, without the bad or good argument, but also that it can lower triglyceride levels, when it's consumed part of, there being a general balance, depending on your genes.
There is I'm not one of those people who can literally rattle off, 2010, Patty Serino, the American Journal. I can remember a couple of them, but there is one that I remember from literally writing about it for 30 years. 1994. The author was Dreon, and it was a study on saturated fat. And she fed, these groups of people in a randomized double-blind controlled study, a lot of saturated fat. And what she found was it raised HDL, lowered LDL, and more importantly, it actually lowered the particles that we're talking about, the number of particles. Your LDL might have gone up, but remember, it can be your overall LDL can go up, but if it's mostly the big fluffy particles, that's less of concern than if your LDL is low, but they're all the bad little inflamed particles. So it can be very deceptive. Your LDL is under 100, your cardiologist is thrilled, but if they don't do the particle test and they don't say, what if 99% of those are the bad guys? That's a much worse condition than if your LDL is elevated, but they're almost all big volleyballs.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and imagine back in that day, I mean, certainly now it's a lot more of the exclusion criteria that are in play genetically. So, I mean, Justin, you have to, I know you're probably itching when you have ApoE and you have, methylation and fat metabolism, and you've got ApoA2 and you've got TCF7L2. Uh, what is this going to tell you? I mean, are we putting somebody on a high fat, I mean, depending on what those genes say, on a high fat diet? Are we telling them they should go keto to lower their cholesterol, or consider a different diet?
There's so many little nuances, right? Because, like, let's say you were to adopt a high saturated fat diet, but you were to not cancel out grains, right? If you're eating a lot of saturated fat alongside a lot of grains, I mean, you're probably still going to get the same insulin resistant issue that you would have gotten anyways. And that's, I think, a big driver with a lot of these heart diseases is insulin resistance. And I think that it ties back to hunter gatherer times. Like when we swapped from being hunter gatherers to really storing grains because they're easy and you can store them for a long time. They're a good source of calories. But civilization kind of like steered towards eating a lot more grains. And I think that's when a lot of these inflammation problems started to come. And inflammation really causes high cholesterol with a lot of people as well. And then toxicity comes in and hardens the cholesterol. And that's what makes it so that we have blood pressure issues because it's like kinking the hose kind of a thing. So when you have a 4 allele in ApoE, for example, your body is not as efficient at clearing the cholesterol, right? Like HDL should be pulling that cholesterol back to the liver once it's done its job of addressing the inflammation. But if we have toxicity present, it hardens the cholesterol. Well, now the cholesterol has to sort of remain elevated. It wasn't able to do its job and then just pull itself back to the liver. So when we talk about Alzheimer's, it's really because of calcifying of that cholesterol and a lifetime of neural inflammation starting because you're getting less and less blood flow to the brain. So it's not that a 4 allele equals Alzheimer's, but a 4 allele means that you're less efficient at using cholesterol to deal with inflammation. And then when we have lots of inflammation and toxicity present, you have less and less overall blood flow. And I think that if you were to have also suboptimal nitric oxide genetics, suboptimal PCSK9, which really influences LDL receptors, now we've got a mixed bag of a bunch of stuff working against you. You know what I mean? So that's why we try to look at it in that way. It's a system with a whole bunch of moving parts. And to Dr. Bowden's point, if we've still got people running around saying good and bad cholesterol, we know it's so much more complicated than that. It's not even worth talking about.
Well, and let's temper the argument. Well, let's temper the discussion, because the next myth that we wanted Dr. Bowden to debunk is that lifestyle factors alone, such as good diet, exercise, are enough and sufficient for everybody. Let's qualify to prevent heart disease.
Well, first of all, I have so many things I wanted to comment on what you just said.
So do it, please.
So smart and so good. I don't even know where to start. I definitely would love to address the insulin thing. You talked about Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is now let's bring it back to metabolic syndrome. Alzheimer's is now referred to as type 3 diabetes. Why is that? Because it has the same underlying mechanism as diabetes, insulin resistance. And that is a commonality to all this. When Steve and I wrote the revised edition of Great Cholesterol Myth in 2020, half that book's on insulin resistance, because that predicts heart disease 10 years before any of these cholesterol tests do. You can see that coming. That is the underlying chronic thing in almost every chronic disease you can think of. There's insulin resistance. Ben Brickman wrote this wonderful book, Why We Get Sick. I think the first chapter is insulin resistance. Jason Fung wrote, the book on cancer. The last chapter is, let's not forget, a whole chapter on insulin resistance. So this is a very big part of Alzheimer's, as well as the genetic things you were talking about. Every one of them is right. But I would also make the argument that something we can correct with diet and lifestyle is insulin resistance, which we can reverse with a different diet, with fasting, with different lifestyle, all the things that we know turn it around. So that's Absolutely. A very important part of that. Now, what was the one you asked me to comment?
Well, and then it segues beautifully into the myth that, and again, let's balance this, that lifestyle alone, that is to say, mitigating toxins, stress, better sleep, better diet, are sufficient, caveat being for everybody, to prevent heart disease? Or is there room for select medications, and even maybe nutraceutical intervention, therapeutic range, prescription drugs.
I actually put that as part of lifestyle.
Okay.
I mean, I take
I think I agree within the
40
right
or 50
fit.
vitamins a day. Isn't that part of lifestyle? Well,
Well,
that's
I
a
agree.
nutraceutical
You know, but
intervention.
I mean, I argue this all the time that it's considered as, I don't know, this is it's a review of nomenclature, I guess. Is natural medicine? No, you're taking an ingredient out of a naturally occurring substance, perhaps, and then using it at very high therapeutic range to which you could never eat yourself into through diet alone. So it's intervention, it's drug nutraceutical intervention. But I'm also asking about the medication prescription side,
Yes,
because we have an amazing set of tests. I mean, the DNA 360 is incredible to inform how you approach mitigating cardiovascular disease at any age. But our pharmacogenomics panel for certain folks, especially those that are on select classes of, the late, old or new statins, or, biosequesters or whatever the heck there might be on, it's informed largely by genomics, I guess, though. But I'm wanting to qualify this statement or call it a myth that lifestyle factors alone for everybody are sufficient to prevent heart disease.
Yeah, I don't have any disagreement with that. Look, I've often said I want to make use of every invention that medicine has come up with that is going to make my life better or extend it in any way. I am very anti-big pharma, but I'm not anti-pharma drugs when they work. I'm not anti-antibiotics. I'm not anti the Salk vaccine. I mean, obviously, medicine has come up with some miraculous things.
And even to Justin's point around PCSK9, we're talking about it in context of genes, because we look at this sort of genetic ratio to offset, this big player we call 9p21, which is endothelial inflammation.
Yes, I'm a big believer in the importance of NP21. And speaking of our PSK9, and Peter Attia is a big fan of this. One of a much better medicine than statins, if you want to go in that route and you want to get your numbers down, is Repatha, which is an injectable, which is a PSK9 inhibitor. And very briefly, people don't know what that is. It's not just that you have so much LDL in your system, it's that it's not being removed.
Right.
Because you've got the receptors aren't working right. And one of the things that makes them not work right is this enzyme called PKS9. So this new class of drugs are PKS9 inhibitors. And then they make the receptors work better. And then when the receptors work, it's okay. Now we can catch the LDL and take it out of the system. So you've got to look at all these things. And if you are someone who's stuck with bad receptors and your cholesterol particle number is going to the roof, by all means, you could spend, without that genetic testing, you could spend years trying to figure out what it is, and you could eat yourself into a fury like, I don't know, no matter what I eat, it keeps going up and nothing's getting rid of it. Your receptors aren't working.
Right.
That's a good analogy that people might be familiar with is vitamin D.
Yeah.
Taking a lot of vitamin D. I don't know, should I take more? It's not going up. I'm getting, maybe your receptors aren't working right. So we got to avail ourselves of these things that medicine can do. That doesn't give a free pass to this avaricious, contentious industry that wants to sell us new drugs every minute.
Overly prescribed, without doing the deep dive.
The big pharma methods without being anti. It's like Dave Asprey says about vaccines. He says, "I'm not anti-vax. I'm bi-curious, vaccine industry curious. I want to see what they can do and what they can help with. That doesn't mean I'm giving a free pass to every one of the 72 things that they're telling 4-year-olds to take. It just means that I'm not going to close the book on the entire industry because some good things come out of there."
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, here's how we're going to.
Sorry, I was going to say, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to pharmaceuticals. There's uses, but they should be the last resort as opposed to the first, second, and third line of defense for our whole lives.
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more.
Here's how we're going to bring in the centenarians before we get to some questions. We've got a lot, and they're all great. I've done a quick scan of them, so we have a lot to go through. But the Centenarian Project. We don't have to, refer to the blue zones and the work of Dan Butner, but generally what we know is that there are certain pockets of the world of people that live for various reasons, lifestyle, diet, belief systems, longer than average. But, and here's the next myth, in context, because they do this, drinking moderate amounts of alcohol.
Oh boy, you're going to go all over the place today, aren't you? All right.
Yeah, we have to. Such as a glass of red wine is widely believed to be beneficial for heart health. And also, studied, this is well studied and certainly specific also to those that are in the blue zone, suggesting that it can reduce cardiovascular risks. Myth, or is it well enough substantiated that it's going to be like eggs are in out week to week? What are we talking here? Because there's no evidence. Everyone's all about, I think it's a 2021, 2022 JAMA publication in cardiology that even one drink a day can significantly risk, cardiovascular disease, irregular heart rhythms,
breast cancer for women over 2 drinks. Yeah. I think some of the difficulty in sorting this out is that alcohol is associated with so many things that are good for you.
Right. Backgrounder effect. Right.
And people should know that that basic conventional wisdom that moderate drinking is heart healthy was 100% paid for by the alcoholic beverage industry, and they did massive marketing to get that message across, and they were successful. And then the article you came said, this thing we've been believing all the time, do you know that that's actually bullshit? I mean, you asked Daniel Amen about the effects of moderate drinking or moderate marijuana use, and he gets apoplectic because he looks at the brain scans. So yes, there is nothing that is good for you physically or physiologically about alcohol, even small amounts. That said,
even microbiome and what the blue zones are doing with locally produced red wine. And I want to underscore red wine because they're not, by and large, drinking beer, doing shots of tequila. They're drinking red wine. And they have this correlation, at least loosely defined, I think now. They have to better study this, but that may, in fact, positively benefit the microbiome. I'm playing devil's advocate.
It may. And I'm not, and the good thing is that for many people, moderate drinking is associated with the relaxing of inhibitions, with more social engagement. They get a little bit more open. They get a little bit more cheery. They feel better. And if they're not alcoholic and they don't have tendencies towards addictive behavior, it's hard to argue that that's going to always be a bad thing if it's combined with the kind of diet you're talking about in the blue zones. Now, that's not the case for most people.
Right.
And nobody should start drinking because of health benefits.
Right.
And let's point out that one of the blue zones is Loma Linda, which is a Seventh-day Adventist community where they
don't drink at all.
Right. So
but they have a lot of sex.
Yes, they do indeed. A lot of
the DNA company, and Justin, you can tell us all about this in super summary format, but we really appreciate and hold in very high regard mood, behavior, executive function, including predisposition to addictions. So before ever even entertaining the idea of creating blanket statements potentially founded in myth that alcohol is good for the heart, I'd at least want to play devil's advocate and even bring in the concept of backgrounder effect, by the way. So I think one way to understand, as you, I think, alluded to a minute ago, Dr. Bowden, is that the negative effects of alcohol could be looked at through the lens or the concept of, backgrounder effect, this term that kind of refers to the idea anyways that in the case of alcohol, the consumption isn't done in isolation. It's often accompanied by other bad habits or other behaviors that exacerbate the health risk, including genomics. In the same way, the best example I can give or draw from is smoked versus processed. Smoked and processed meats versus fresh meat. Obviously, smoked meats, bacon, carry higher health risks, right? If you eat bacon and pepperettes all day, that's not a carnivore diet, or at least not one we'd ever advocate given your genes. And that's because of the additives and the processing methods and nitrates and all this other shit. So, I believe that has to be at least considered for. But you're right. There are a lot of people who are predisposed to, addictions. But that's, who was it? Thomas Edison, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone in this group knows. Everything in moderation, including moderation itself. I love that term. I love
Yeah, I'm
that.
not a big believer of everything in moderation. I think it's really crappy advice.
Well, hence the extension, including moderation itself.
Yeah.
Right? That's I think the brilliance of that quote, because it's got to be qualified that you can't apply it all the time.
Yeah. It's
Anyway,
like the 80-20 rule, right? It's like people talk about the 80-20 rule when it comes to diet. And I'm like, 20% of the time you're going to eat like shit. Are you serious? Let's call it 95-5 if you really want to do well and live a long life. I don't think you should do anything that's bad for you 20% of the time. That's a lot.
Agreed.
Right? So including alcohol. I mean, and maybe if you stomped on the grapes your damn self and did the whole thing, then you can guarantee that it's just one ingredient and you made it. Yeah. But you're increasing your GABA production in a pretty unnatural way. And yeah, you're getting resveratrol, but you're also getting ethanol. It's counterbalancing it. At best, you're coming out neutral, but you're most likely going to make some bad choices and you're going to have some wings with it and you're going to.
And maybe disturbing your sleep. But if we took the backgrounder effect in these blue zones, here's the argument I've heard. And I'm not playing advocate for red wine as much as I actually admittedly love it in moderation. Is that if it brings relaxation, to your point, Dr. Bowden, and it brings community and it brings people together and perhaps gives some benefit biologically, physiologically on the microbiome, in that one glass a day at lunch prior to a siesta, you know what? I don't know. I'm thinking there may be benefit, but again, it's hard to know. We have to consider the genetics behind this, mood, executive function, predisposition to addictions, as well as detox pathways. How do people not just deal with aldehyde or alcohol dehydrogenase, but how do they deal with the outcomes of the toxins that coincide with the winemaking process? So,
or how much alcohol dehydrogenase do people make? There's individual amounts. Some make a lot, some don't make very much.
Here's a litmus test for that, and particularly elevated in the Asian population, Chinese Han population, is the face goes real red. I mean, it's Asian flushing syndrome, as it's loosely referred to in cytogenetics, anyway. But so we have questions. We have a lot of them. We should jump into those.
Okay.
And the first one's anonymous, which is fine as long as they're good questions. How do you get a better LDL small particle score if it isn't good? LDL's one thing, but particle size, reiterate why that's important. Tell us about, LP little a and the whole gamut of particle size, why it's potentially important to test and what to do about it if it's high.
Well, that's great questions. And I get that a lot because I get a lot of clients who see me privately who come in with cholesterol tests that they are confused about, or that their doctor has told them things that they're beginning to question, and I help them sort it out. And I do see a lot of people, myself included, who had a very high particle size. One of the reasons I'm passionate about this test is not only can it the conventional test is probably responsible for many people getting prescriptions for statins that they don't need. But the conventional test also may be responsible for some people not getting treated when they need to be. For example, moi. So for years before I knew about the particle test, my cholesterol tests were a doctor's dream. Under 200, great LDL. Oh, you're going to live forever. This is fantastic. Then I get the particle test. The particles are 2,500, and they're the small, dense ones. That was obscured by just the way a less atherogenic profile would be obscured by by just, grossly mixing it into two categories of good and bad. So could a very dangerous profile like mine be obscured by just looking at good and bad, because it was hiding this data. So I was confronted with, what do you do about the particle size, especially if you don't want to take drugs? Well, there are some things that may work well enough to get it down. And if they don't, you might want to think about then that's the point where I'd say, okay, now we've tried all this. Let's give some statins or Repatha or what other medications. Let's give them a chance. But the ones I try first there are two that I would say are at the top of the list. The first is time-release niacin, wax matrix niacin. And that is Endurance Products Company makes
and it can't be niacinamide. It has to be niacin, right?
Yeah, and it can't be no flush niacin. Throw
That's
that
right.
out, it does nothing. So
Yeah.
the time release niacin I like because in that wax matrix, I don't do commercial for them, but the point is that it releases it slowly and deliberately over 4 to 8 hours, and that is really one of the best things you can do, and it's a significant dose. The dose that has been recommended to me by 2 major cardiologists. The sweet spot seems to be 1,500. It's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000, but 1,500 a day is what I always recommend. And the second thing, and you're going to love this, you guys, and the best way I can tell you is when I was dealing with the particle test, I went down to see Douglas Trifon, who is the head of the lipid clinic at Scripps Institute in La Jolla. It's possibly one of the most prestigious places in the world, and he is one of the most prestigious cardiologists in the world. And I went to his office, and I was so delighted. I took a picture of it surreptitiously to show friends because I've never seen it. His office looked like it was like nothing but supplements. You ever see a cardiologist who had like 50 supplements behind that he could, right? So I said, what do I do about this number? It's kind of high, and I'd like to prevent like having to go on Repatha or something like that. And he dramatically turns around to grab something off the shelf. And I'm going, I wonder what this is going to be. And he comes back and he smacks this down. And you know what it was? Extra virgin olive oil.
I was going to say olive oil.
A quarter of a cup every single day. Drink this shit.
Yeah.
He didn't say drink that shit.
You know, and I think one of the actives that are arguably one of the most important that we often forget about in there are the sterols. Sterolins, you know, I mean, a lot of omegas are talked about, and there's some various constituents, cavalcrol, et cetera. But plant sterols and sterolins, I mean, by the way, we should endorse the endurance product line because it's found. First of all, like you, I'm a huge proponent of ingredients. We're not talking about a brand. I think it's called Enduracin, isn't it? Enduracin. Yeah. Endura or Endur-Sin or something. Anyways, but it's the wax matrix, which I'm familiar with. It's an ingredient, and it's found in all kinds of products that you can purchase on Amazon or iHerb or online. And it's the slow release. So it's not going to cause the flushing, but because
it doesn't, that's not true. It causes
it's minimal.
Mild,
right.
I take it.
Right.
And it's I hate the flush. I hate it. It's very mild and very tolerable, and half the time you don't notice it.
Yeah. Okay, so next question from Betty is, my DNA said that I don't assimilate fat well, dietary fat, I'm assuming. When I went on a keto diet, I didn't lose weight. What diet should I follow? I wonder if she's had her DNA 360 because we advise exactly on that. I wonder also if you could answer that, Dr. Bowden, but also, are we over-focused on I mean, again, we tell you about macros and micros at the DNA company based on your genomics, but for general pop, are we over-focused on the macros and macro split more than we should be maybe focused about the refined shit that we got to get out of our diet?
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes. Jeffrey Bland said it once. Eating real food is the number one piece of advice that I give on every podcast when they say, so how do we make sense of all this diet? And should it be carnivore? Should it be vegan? Should it be, what's a macro part? And I just say, here's the one piece of advice. If you just follow this and simplify it to this is all you need to know. Eat real food. Now, it's simple, but it's not easy because people don't know what real food is. So they say, well, are kale chips real food? No, kale is real food. Kale chips are processed food. They may be better than Lay's potato chips, but I want you to eat stuff that comes from what I used to narcissistically call the Johnny Bowden 4 food groups. Food you could have hunted, fished, gathered, or plucked. If you could gather, if you were a caveman or you were living in the African Serengeti with nothing but a stick to catch food, could you hunt it? Could you fish it? Could you gather it off the ground, or could you pluck it off a tree? If you could, it's probably good for you. And if you start with that, you don't have to figure out macros. Now, does that mean you wouldn't benefit by being a little more careful about like what proportion of fat, what proportion of protein, how many grams of protein you get? All of that's important, but the most important is that you get this ultra-processed crap out of your diet. That is what's killing us.
Right. And I would also argue, or at least add to that, that you could probably get away with the illustration of somebody who's maybe 3 greats divided from us in lineage. So your great, great, great grandparent, what did they eat? Probably eating that as real food, at least a lot closer than what we know today. However, this is the paradox for me. And this is why we're always back to genomically informed. We haven't lived longer than about age 45 to 50, more than the last 300 years. I mean, so we don't know the level of cardiovascular disease that would have taken hold in this older population 200-300 years ago. Justin, just for Betty, first of all, diet I should follow, like it's the wrong terminology. We want lifestyle, but why didn't she lose weight? What do we know about the keto diet and genetics? Because I mean, we're talking like what, 25% of the population runs into this conundrum.
Yeah, well, and there's so many nuances as always, right? Because there's dirty keto versus clean keto. To Dr. Bowden's point, I mean, you could do a keto diet on all this garbage, right? Fat bombs and all these packaged things that they just say keto, in big letters across the thing, versus like actual, you had avocados and you had vegetables and you had some high quality grass-fed meat, and you're on a ketogenic diet. But keto is like really, really high fat, and you can do it in a cleaner or a dirtier manner.
You certainly can.
Earlier in the call, we talked about calories in versus calories out, and this thing where everyone's black and white. Well, that doesn't work. Or yes, it does work. Well, calories in, calories out matters, but food is information. And between A and Z there, we've got hormones, we've got microbiome status, we've got your activity, we've got insulin genetics and fat processing genetics and starch processing genetics. There's so much going on. We've even got psychosomatic components to it, right? So it's like if you go into a certain diet with a good mindset versus a shitty one, even that is going to change the way that your microbiome actually assimilates the food. So if you're talking specifically about your ApoA2 gene and that being suboptimal, then yeah, at a baseline genetically, you don't have the greatest fatty acid metabolism. And on purpose, eating a really high fat diet like keto is likely not in your interest because you just can't process it as well as someone else might. You're going to also have to look at your TCF7L2 if you happen to have done our gene test, because that's your insulin mechanism, and that matters there. Also, your AMY1 gene is more for starch metabolism, right? So if you're totally optimal there and totally suboptimal for ApoA2, you may do better on more of a higher carb paleo diet, right? Still real food. That's the most important thing. I agree completely with Johnny. Really, I mean, you could prioritize protein and low glycemic veggies, and you don't have to necessarily add in the bacon and the fat bombs, etc. My real recommendation here is a coaching program, because there's so much shit to go over that it's too difficult to do on a webinar.
And by the way, Justin, I wanted to point out for people who are not aware of this, and that's most of the population, a paleo diet that everybody thinks is all meat. The actual paleo diet, and this has been researched, Boyd and Eaton, they did 2 papers, one in 1985 and another was a follow-up after that, looking at all the existent hunter-gatherer societies, and what the paleo diet actually consisted of was 65%, 35% animal food, 65% vegetation. Now, during the paleo time,
and carbs
were not our carbs.
Right.
They were not eating pretzels. They were eating bitter little fruits and fibrous little vegetables, and not, but it was 65% non-animal products and 30%. But you know what? 100% real food.
Real food. I argue, and by the way, that real food was also devoid of a lot of the chemical. Even if we have real food on the table, we're also contending with a lot of the stuff the real food's carrying with it. So there are genes for that as well. Detox genes to process all this. I mean, it's impossible. And let alone the argument that the food that used to have the level of, let's say, magnesium and manganese and boron and strontium doesn't exist anymore. Like our soils are hyper rotated. And anyway, long story short, if I'm ever questioning a complex concept like this, I default and fall back on evolutionary biology. And the way I think about this is they're berries and nuts and seeds and tubers they came across. And I feel like they netted out on the calorie consumption. They got their trace minerals and stuff that wasn't in meat, which is very few things, and their polyphenols and their vitamins, so forth. But they probably netted out on the caloric consumption versus the expenditure on their way to hunting the meat. So anyway, that's my thought. Ansel, this is for you. This is a perfect question for you, Dr. Bowden, by Echo Lee, who asks, considering the Ansel, at least comments, considering the Ansel keys and this faulty 21 country study, in conjunction, she mentions with President Eisenhower's physician, who started the AMA, or the rather the AHA, the American Heart Association, and the food pyramid started. She mentions the ball rolling toward false association between dietary fat and cardiovascular disease. I think we can just all say agreed on that one. More of a statement than a question. Mm-hmm. Carol's asking, she's got a family history of high blood pressure, and she's knows and aware is genetically influenced. However, not found help in interpreting the genes SNPs to correct the high blood pressure nutritionally. First of all, my comment has to be, we never focus on one SNP. It's always pathway. You've heard Justin talk to, but do you want to talk a little bit, about what you understand, Dr. Bowden, as it relates to the correlation between hypertension, the ensued cardiovascular disease, and maybe even extend into like this idea of, beyond cholesterolemia, or for that matter, peripheral cardiovascular, the disease in which is ensued from deposits. We have other problems, some of which are genetic, meaning, strokes, peripheral tension, or 50% of the vasculature in the body is the microvessels. There's diseases from within those, and as well hardening of the arteries. With a family history of all of that, how can we lead her toward sort of a nutritional intervention that might cover the gamut? What's a heart healthy diet? There's a better question.
What's a heart healthy diet? So, well, first let me say this about blood pressure. Blood pressure is a serious risk factor. And I am not of the opinion that if there's a medication that is healthy to take that's going to lower your blood pressure, that you shouldn't do it. Right. Telmisartan, by some accounts, is an anti-aging drug. I mean, it has a lot of very helpful effects. So not all drugs. Metformin is an anti-aging drug, and that's a drug for diabetes that I take, not because I'm diabetic, but because I'm hoping that the National Institute of Health's research on this as an anti-aging drug is going to.
You take full dose, or do you take microdose?
No. I take 850 twice a day. I'm full in on metformin. But my point is that, don't ignore blood pressure and just think that you can bring that down with lifestyle medicine. I mean, magnesium helps. There's a lot of things that can be helpful for that. Cocoflavanols appear to be associated with lower blood pressure because the Kona Indians are like one of the only groups in the world that don't get higher blood pressure as they get older, and they've attributed its correlation, not causation, but it's very suspicious. They eat a ton of cocoa and they just don't get higher blood pressure as they get older. But the point is, if you do have that, take it seriously. It's not the worst thing in the world to take blood pressure medication, and if that will get it down, I mean, it's a big risk factor.
Here's something, my 2 cents. I need to try first. How good clinical, outcomes with this. And by the way, that reminds me, we've somehow we'd be remiss if we didn't fully endorse the literature behind omega-3 fatty acids.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, what this does to the endothelium, and that's the lining, the very sensitive
anti-inflammatory,
and to the musculature, the smooth muscles around the, and of course, and Justin alluded to it earlier, anything that might enhance nitric oxide, polyphenols, et cetera. But I've had good clinical outcomes with Bonito peptides. And these are, not in the sort of new, excitement around peptides, but these little, they're kind of like anchovy-like fish. And the mechanism of action in the extracts of the peptides that come from the Bonito fish is very similar. And I like trying that. Usually what this brings down is the either isolated systolic hypertensive individuals. So like somebody's got like 140 over 85, right? Or the mild to moderate hypertensive, non-alarming hypertensive situation. So 140 to 150 over 90, 95. And the mechanism of action is the angiotensin converting enzyme, which obviously, plays such a huge role in vasoconstriction, so and fluid volumes. So by inhibiting ACE, these Bonito peptides lower blood pressure, and it seems to work really well in that particular cohort. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Oh, and here's a great question that kind of falls in line as well. Are you all fans on pycnogenol to reverse, at least in context of reversing ages, or the advanced glycation end products, I guess April's referring to?
I'll let you take that one, Bryce.
Do you have you have your opinion, Jess? On the I mean, this is one of the oldest goodies.
All I really know is that it's a good quality antioxidant, and that's usually a useful thing. I've never clinically used it or seen any particular results, so I don't have a intelligent answer on that one.
I would say something about the general category of supplements, if you think it might be helpful. I get asked about these kinds of things a lot. Pycnogenol, resveratrol, whatever the thing of the moment is. And they are all good. They all do good things. But in the real world, dealing with normal people who are not like us and are not willing to take 2 bags of 40 supplements each every single day, or the equivalent, I don't think the ROI is like, if somebody's on the tennis court, they're drinking a lot, they got a big belly, they want to get healthy, and I read about this thing, Pycnogenol, it's great. That's not where I'd start.
Right? It's not a starting point.
I want to see those people on a multiple magnesium, fish oil, and vitamin D, and possibly a probiotic if it's correctly prescribed. I'm not going to go off onto even things like glucosamine and chondroitin, which I take for my joints because I have no cartilage in my shoulder. There are specialty things that'll work for joint health, and specialty things that'll work for heart health. And there's so many of them. And Pycnogenol is wonderful. I've heard people say, oh, it's great for skin. All these things are great for many things, but you got to ask yourself, if there's this budget for supplements and this tolerance for how many pills you will take, what are you going to get the biggest bang for your nutritional supplement buck? So that's,
no, I agree.
That's all I want to say. That is not in any way a diss on Pycnogenol or any other of the supplements that people might ask about. They're all, it's just not number one on my hit parade for people who are taking nothing.
Right. I agree. I also like the way that she's framed the question. It's very simple and it's very to the point. Are you fans of it to reverse ages, right? Which is the advanced glycation end products. And there's context in this, right? I wrote my whole first book, The Antioxidant Prescription, on this very notion. So first of all, it's a good example and illustrates the idea of nutraceutical therapeutic intervention, because it's most often extracted from French maritime pine bark. I just happen to know. Mm-hmm. So, and when we're talking in context of ages, these have extensive damaging effects to that endothelium that we've been referring to, which again, once it's once there's damage there, that puts out the warrant, regardless of levels, as we've been talking about, high, low, whatever, that puts out the warrant for deposition of cholesterol, right? So when you have this major contribution, ages are high, to oxidative stress, inflammation, tissue damage, that's the driving force behind plaque deposition, the proverbial Band-Aid, right? But what the research says, and this is, but here's the thing: we test for the speed at which you're aging. We have a test called the DNA aging test, DNA aging, which looks at methylation endpoints, CPG points, methylation, the speed at which biological versus chronological has everything to do with this, right? So it's not just neutralizing free radicals and the age-old story of oxidative stress. It's been shown to directly inhibit formation of ages. And this has been published multiple times, diabetes journals, some of the big peer-reviewed journals, New England Journal of Medicine, that improves vascular flexibility. By the way, goes back to the story of nitric oxide and vessel function. So peripheral vascular endothelial malleability. I don't have a better term for that, but improves flexibility. That's a better term. I mean, the main, I think, mechanism of action, probably upstream at the, in the cell, is inhibition of NF-kappa beta. I mean, this is the learnings of Jeffrey Bland, Dr. Bland, or early days. It's an oldie but goodie, but I'll leave it there.
But let me just say one last thing about that, if I may, to bring it back to what we were talking about a heart healthy diet and about, the basic information about real food and stuff. What are ages? They are sugars that have glommed onto proteins. And when those sugars glom onto the proteins, it makes them stickier. So it's like a tadpole that can get into the capillaries. Now, all of a sudden, you've coated it with cotton candy. So instead of figuring out how do we fix and make them less, how about eating less sugar?
Right.
It's real simple. You don't need all the cellular mechanism to undo damage that you've got only because you're eating too much sugar in the first place.
No, true. Yeah. And we can't forget the the processes that are probably the underpinning of neurodegeneration. All right. Besides,
I'm telling you, so much of it comes back to a high sugar, high starch diet.
of course.
Yeah, that's why I have a concept in my coaching that I say that it's a process of deletion before it's a process of addition.
Oh, Justin, that is so smart, man.
Yeah, because people want to add stuff, right?
That is so smart. And that's the whole purpose of a rotation diet.
Yeah.
And an elimination diet. You start by taking stuff out, right?
Yeah. Remove what's causing the inflammation as opposed to trying to put the fire out by adding something.
I couldn't say it better.
Well, to extend on your concept of, or at least a financial analogy, Dr. Bowden, when you're talking about credit and spending out of credit, maybe this is more, to borrow from what Justin just said, balancing the books. If you look at both sides, that we all hate to think back to 11th grade accounting class, but when you had to do a balance table in the end,
I never had to do that. I don't even know what you're talking about.
No, you never did. You never did accounting.
You're always more mathematical than me. You're much
high
better.
school. Oh, I am the least mathematical person.
No, you can figure out the check when we go out to dinner. I mean, you're very good at that stuff.
Well, yeah. So we have a long but good question from Virginia, and we'll try to blast through some of these others because there's so many great questions tonight. Everybody, got a history of
guys.
family.
I have kind of a hard out pretty close to now. It's 4:30 my time, and I have a 5:15.
Thank you for reminding us. Let's take this one, and then we're gonna let you go. Right. And then Justin and
I will. I could stay here and talk all day, but I was.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you in advance for coming. I really appreciate your expertise.
My pleasure and honor.
This is a great question, though, and there's some breadth to it here. So she's got a family history of cardiovascular disease. Her dad got a stent in 2014. She's been on statins ever since. Around 10 years ago, she reports LDL cholesterol started going up. And despite her lifestyle changes, which included intermittent fasting, good fats, included low-carb diet, her LDL has been starting to go up. And last year's scan said that she had a 30% blockage in her left artery. She'd like to know why her LDL is going up. And again, this is the whole myth, perhaps over focusing on LDL. And should she be worried? What other actions might she take?
I think it's a complicated question that I wouldn't feel comfortable giving her really targeted advice. I don't know her. I don't know her blood work. I don't know her as a patient.
Sure.
These things happen. I would never panic about them. They're lab tests. Let's see what we can do about them. But as I have said many, many times, we want to concentrate on the things we can change that make a difference. Right. And it is amazing to me. I'll just end with this because it's the message I like to leave everybody with in anything that I do. It's my legacy message. If you want to know what predicts, the only reason people are asking these questions is they all want to live long and healthy. That is the purpose, right? So yes, pay attention to that LDL that's going up. Let's find out why it's happening. Let's do a particle test and see if the bad ones are going up. And then let's see what we can do. Okay, all of that's true, but let's also keep in mind that the end goal is living long and living well. And we know what predicts that. We know absolutely through research what the number one predictor of that is. And it is not your LDL. It is not your insulin resistance. It is nothing you can measure on a lab test. The number one secret to long and healthy and happy life. You ready for this? It's going to come out of left field. And there's data to prove it. You ready? Make friends and family your number one priority.
Yeah.
End of story. You want to know what they do in the blue zones? That's what they do in the blue zones.
Ikigai and family. No, that's absolutely true.
So that's like what I tell people who come to me and they're very, very concerned about their tests. And at the end of the session, I usually ask them about their family and their face lights up. And what are you doing this weekend? Oh, my kids. And da, da, da. I said, okay, you got a health bank. These tests, they're a little bit of a withdrawal. That family you just talked about, those friendships you just nurtured about, that's a withdrawal. That's a deposit of $1 million.
Totally.
Worry about that.
Absolutely. And as good as that is, as good as that is, as advice goes, as it relates to an outro and sayonara, and thank you so much, Dr. Bowden, for joining us. I'd be so remiss if I didn't ask you for 1 minute, 30 more seconds to answer this last one, which is a myth. And just and how do you respond to the research? This is from Dirk, who's asking the research of Dr. Dean Ornish, Caldwell Esselstyn, Colin Campbell, et cetera, that prove that whole plant diet, like vegan and vegetarian, is the key factor in reversing and preventing heart disease. That's your out.
That's not a 1 minute answer. There are two doctors who are very big at the Cleveland Clinic. One is Carl Esselstyn, who advocates a zero fat diet, and the other is Mark Hyman. Two very, very different approaches. And the low-fat diet will work, but not the way we do it in this country. If you got your fat down to like under 5% or 10% and you ate mostly vegetables and good high sources of protein, you'd probably do fine. This 30% fat is not a low-fat diet. It's not a high-fat diet. It's an American diet of crap food.
Right.
So it's not about the percentage of fat.
Right.
You can do really, really well with a high-fat diet. Some people will not. And you can do very, very, very well with an extremely low-fat diet. Most people will not, but some will.
Indigenous Eskimos.
In Ornish's study, I will say this. You want to talk about multifactorial? This is what this guy did. So let's please be aware of it. He didn't just put people on a low-fat diet. He took a bunch of men, high-stress, type A types, and he put them on a 1-year program that involved the following: smoking cessation, anger management, relationship coaching. They spend a lot of time talking to each other, sleep therapy, nutritional supplements. They took them off of sugar. And yes, he had a low-fat diet. I would argue that program would have worked with a high-fat diet. It wasn't a low-fat diet. That's my opinion. It was, you do all those 6 things with other people, you can put them on a moderate fat diet. Believe me, that's not going to remove but he did get those results once in that one study.
Right. Thank you so much, Doc. We really appreciate your time. And stay playing tennis. I know your blue zone is actually a tennis court, which is paved blue.
Did you see that video?
I did. That was great.
So I sent it to you. People can reach me on my website, and you can also book time with me if you ever want to talk to me about this stuff.
Well, and coming up, by the way, everyone here should keep a note of this. We'll send dates around soon, but Dr. Bowden's going to be one of our feature experts on a men's health series that's coming up in the next couple of months. So, well, we really appreciate that. Thanks so much, Dr. J.
Love you guys. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Bryce. I will see you.
All right, sounds good. So we'll finish up a couple extra questions here for folks that might want to stick around if we can. Let's see. We've got what did we just answer? Virginia. So we've got it. We've got Echo Lisa asking, would you review the importance of fractionated lipid studies in the discussion of cardiovascular disease versus standard lipid profiles? You know what? Let me take this one quick. I think one of the best. Actually, I wonder if I can share my screen. As I pull this up, somebody, maybe hopefully a team in the back end, can give me access to sharing my screen if I don't already have it. I'm going to pull up what's called a cardiometabolic panel by Doctors Data, and any of our coaches can requisition this panel, and it beautifully complements some of the cardiovascular risk analysis that we, of course, look at in the DNA 360 that you're very familiar with, Justin. You start there. At all times, but then complemented by this, and it answers the question that she just asked. I think they've done it the best. I think really they've put together some of the best. It's a blood lipid panel. Just trying to find here it is, sample report. If I can share my screen, and I'll give logic. So, Justin, can you see this?
Yep.
So, obviously we're going to get our total cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL, LDL fraction, very low density lipoprotein, non-HDL, which is calculated. These last three parameters are all calculated. Oxidized cholesterol. We just talked about that's actually not often discussed, but we talked about it in context of ages. We talked about it in context of nitric oxide, in context of free radicals. Once you have an angry oxidized low density, you're in trouble. It's one of the instigators, by the way, in the inflammatory response in the thelium. And then you look at your small dense LDL. That's a huge marker. LP little a, right? Fraction, lipoprotein little a. That's huge. Familial, very difficult to reduce if it's high. PCSK9 inhibitors have shown some promise. But other than those guys, the ApoB and the ApoA-B to A1 ratio, Dr. Peter Attia, we talked about him, Dr. Bowden brought him up, talks about ApoB as probably the single most important factor. I'd combine that with LP little a and oxidized LDL. I think those three together. But then what this lab puts together are inflammatory markers. PLA2 activity, right? Which is upstream thromboxane and downstream 11-dehydrothromboxane, all these things. This is inflammation, right? Homocysteine, C-reactive protein, and then your apolipoproteins we talked about, but then your metabolic risk, which again, the genetics we look at the DNA company help to understand this. When you put the cardiometabolic panel together, and now we're talking about, in this case, glycomark, which is a proprietary that looks more like 6 weeks versus 12 weeks, like the A1C. This is much more sensitive, and it'll adjust for hyper as well as hypoglycemic events for your overall blood sugar over time. Leptin, adiponectin signals from the brain that, sort of backbone this, just like our, MC4R, right? If you're a snacker and you're constantly, ghrelin dominant, what's that doing? Causing you to eat frequently. So anyway, I'm going on and on here, but my point is to answer that question about getting specific about fractionated lipid studies and additional endpoints. I don't know better tests. I use it clinically all the time, along with the DNA 360 to get real time around how somebody is improving first and foremost. And then Satya is asking about the work of Dr. McCullough, the huge spike in younger people. I don't know clearly due to vaccines. I think the jury's still out, but it seems it's pretty compelling that whether it's the vaccine or getting sick, the spike protein, I will just say blanket statement, is quite compelling that it's likely to be contributing factor for sure, and that's being conservative to say that. You have an insight without getting yourself in legal hot water here?
Yeah, or without getting this webinar, so we can't put it on YouTube.
Right.
I think that it's a combination of a couple factors there as well, because as the rollout of those mRNA vaccines came about, there was also a tremendous cultural thing going on as well, where young people were exposed to weird stuff. Right. Like when I went to school, there was no point where we were forced to wear masks. There was no point where I was forced to distance from my school chums. You know what I mean? We were in there playing rugby and beating the crap out of each other. And it was a very normal thing. I think that the stress combined with the spike proteins and all of those things together caused a really difficult environment for a lot of people. I mean, the hand sanitizers, right? All these different things that we were being forced to do all at once did not do anybody's cardiovascular health any good. But I do think that there's a fair amount of evidence that the shots themselves may have also been a significant contributor there. And I'm going to go call my lawyer in the next few minutes here.
Oh, man. What's going on? Do you know for any discounts that we have going on right now for folks that are tuned in? What do we have going? Is it still the 65 off? Or
yeah, I think the 65 off is still active as far as I know. I'm glad that you mentioned that the Men's Health Summit that we're going to be doing as well. I'm so looking forward to that. Dr. Bowden, you, myself, we've got other great people lined up. So stay tuned for those things as well, because we got a lot of cool stuff coming down the pipe.
Yeah, we had so many great questions tonight. We didn't even get to them all. So thank you everyone for submitting them. And if you want to send them in, via email, we can try to get to those. If you haven't already done your DNA 360 test, please go do it and share this information with loved ones and family. We're We have such an excellent cardiovascular panel, but of course, the genes that are involved in that are not exclusive. You want to know detox, methylation, hormones, you know, it's all relevant. So I guess I'll end off with, you know, stepping into this future of predictability on toward vitality and resilience and longevity. Make the choice to invest in your health. Your health is an investment. It's never an expense. We have clear-cut inference into predispositions, cardiovascularly, cardiometabolically, and we can use that information to do a you study, and then with that information, put years on your life. We're changing the day you die, preventing heart attacks, not us, you will, given the knowledge and experience that we help you with and provide you through genomics learned through your genetic susceptibilities. So thanks so much for joining us this evening, and we'll look forward to our next one.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wild. Always a pleasure. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Cheers, Joss. Thank you.